is compassion. And I would imagine that some of you are here because you want to meet Jeff Weiner and hear what he has to say, because he's a pretty rad dude, and I think it's a real honor and privilege to have him come here. And I think that he would support me in saying that while some people may think he's cool, it's what he wants to talk to you about today that's really cool. And that is that we need to teach our kids compassion. That compassion is something that at very young ages are the foundation for how we think about our place in the world and how we treat people, how we see ourselves and our place in the world, but also how we interact with one another. And I think it probably goes without saying, but our current sort of political, socio-political climate right now is such that we're reminded constantly of the need to step on that foundation of compassion as we think about how we interact with one another and the world, and also how we give ourselves some grace in the whole process. And so I'm really excited to be bringing this topic to you. And I'm also really excited to have Jeff be joined by somebody who I know very well and respect very much, and I know many of you do as well, and that is our amazing principal of Oak Knoll School, Kristen Gracia. Who before she even knew Jeff, was committed to compassion and has worked her whole career, both as a teacher, a vice principal, and now a principal, in developing classrooms and schools that build kids' capacity for compassion, build their skills in compassion, build their language around compassion, and expect that compassion is at the heart of what it is that, or how it is that we interact in our schools. So I'm really excited for you to hear her story as well. Before we hear from them, however, we're going to get an opportunity to see a video, and there's two reasons for it. One, it's a great sort of introduction to what we're about to talk about, and it sort of whets your appetite. But two, you will notice that the seats we're going to be sitting in are actually behind the screen. And so we're going to actually watch the video first, because then the screen's going to go up and then we'll sit down. And so there will be some things that are talked about in this video where you might be like, I'm not sure what that is. Don't worry, they're going to explain it. But it does talk a little bit about a project that both Kristen and Jeff have been partnering on outside of Oak Knoll School. And that's called the Compassion Project, and it's going to sort of set the stage for our conversation tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthias, who's going to dim the lights just a bit and show us the video.
There's something magical that happens when kids cross a threshold.
Hi, good morning.
Compassion education really starts when the kids arrive.
So let's talk about what kindness looks like, okay?
Compassion is a lifelong skill.
That's how important our kind acts are.
You're truly creating a place where kids can be themselves and feel safe. And I think that is the heart of compassion education, right? If kids feel safe and are willing to take risks, they're going to excel in ways that they didn't even believe were possible.
My vision, our collective vision for the Compassion Project, is to ensure that compassion is not only taught in every school in the United States and ideally beyond on a global basis, but that every kid in every one of those classrooms is capable of practicing compassion.
It just feels really good when someone is sad and you just make their day by making them feel better.
The Compassion Project is just that. It's a project. The project utilizes technology to get those most important conversations going in their classroom so that students can benefit through problem solving, class discussions, role playing, critical thinking. All of these 21st century skills are built into this project.
Today we're going to talk about what is the very foundation of compassion, and that is called empathy. Just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, imagining what it's like to be them at that moment.
If we all just understood the importance and were able to practice getting out of our own heads and putting ourselves in the shoes of others to understand just for a brief moment where they're coming from and why they think the way that they do, I think it would just create so much good.
Let me help you out, Aaron. I trip all the time. No big deal.
I don't think any of us got into the field of education to say I want to move
students to the next grade level. We thought about where do we want kids to be in life. You know, the vision is that students across America and across the world will see themselves as the solution and capable, confident people that can share their voice, take action, and help others. Think about those kids growing up like that and how powerful that could be for our world.
Yes, feel free to clap. So while Matthias is getting up the screen and shining the lights on the stage, our guests are going to get situated. I do want to preface our conversation to assure you that what we're going to talk about today is not a sales pitch for the Compassion Project. By the way, the Compassion Project is a total free tool available to schools. But it is an illustration, an outcropping of the passion that both of these two individuals have around compassion, and it's something that we're going to be talking about in our conversation, and so we thought we'd share with you a little bit of a video that sort of brings it to life, and obviously you probably saw some familiar faces in there in the video. All right? All right. All right, well, welcome, you two. Are your mics working?
I think so.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Okay,
Sounds
good.
good.
Awesome. Well, we're going to have a little fireside chat without the fire.
Okay.
I have a few questions that I'm going to run through with them, and it's kind of, I think, knowing both of them, too, it's going to be a discussion between the two of them, and I'm going to be, and I'm not checking my texts. I have my questions on the phone here. But I'm going to engage them in some questions to sort of frame the topic, and then we're going to open it up to you guys for questions, and Vidya and Krista will come around with stick mics to allow you to ask your questions, and we expect to be out of here by 8 o'clock, so we're excited to have you. All right, so first I wonder if you guys might just tell us a little bit about your background so we sort of know who you are. Not everybody in the audience is an Oak Knoll parent or necessarily follows you on social media or anything, so just tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of like how you got to this place.
All right. Well, I'm Kristen Gracia, principal at Oak Knoll School. This is my 19th year in the Menlo Park City School District. I started out as a teacher and kind of grew up through teaching and coaching teachers and found myself at Oak Knoll School, which I think is just about the best place in the world. And really, if we're going into like what brings us here is, as a classroom teacher, I quickly discovered the connection between academic success and child development and social emotional learning and how they played together and the connectedness between them. And because of that connection, I realized that my work as a teacher was really to teach them not only reading, writing, and math, but also these social emotional learning skills. And I don't know any teacher who really doesn't, in elementary school, teach social emotional learning, because it's like just a field of opportunity. You have all these kids looking at you every day, interacting. And for me, I developed a life skill program in my classroom that really helped me orient the kids and create a common language for us, and compassion was one of those life skills. And so as I kind of grew up, like I said, through the Menlo Park City School District here, as an educator, I brought that with me, and I've just always felt the importance of making sure kids have those skills and are practicing those skills, because I believe they're foundational, and that academic learning just comes much easier when kids have a strong foundation of social emotional learning and compassion education. So that brings me here, and I was so fortunate to meet Jeff. I met him on a tour, I think, of Oak Knoll School, and then later he joined our site council, and that's kind of how I connected with Jeff as a parent.
Jeff, what about you? What beyond being the CEO of LinkedIn and a passionate advocate for compassion, anything that would be important for us to know as an introduction?
So it's a pretty long origin story that I'm going to try to condense so we can get to the audience's questions as soon as we can. But when I was in high school, I went to a public high school in a suburb of New York when I was growing up. And it was a great school. And in retrospect, it's, I feel like we had so much that was given to us. But at the time, I felt like things could be done very differently. I remember 15 or 16 years old, staring out the window and thinking this process could be reformed in a really meaningful way. And I became very interested in education reform. And as I was making choices throughout my life, whether it was what school I was going to, what I wanted to study, what I did professionally, I never forgot that, and it very heavily influenced my choices. So there's that arc to why I'm here. And I wrote a book when I was about 30 years old called The Art of Happiness. And it's about the teachings of the Dalai Lama. And I knew very little about the Dalai Lama. And I knew even less about compassion. And it was a word that, like all of you, I had heard growing up, but I had never been taught the real meaning. And I certainly hadn't been taught how to practice it or the importance of it. And it was also in that book for the first time I learned the difference between empathy and compassion, which for me kind of would forever change the way I thought about the world and my place in it. And like a lot of folks, especially in Western society, I had always used empathy and compassion synonymously, as if they could be interchanged. And it turns out they're very different, and there's important distinctions between the two that are absolutely essential to practicing them. And in the book, the Dalai Lama talks about the fact that empathy is feeling what another living thing feels, while compassion is putting yourself in the shoes of another person, seeing the world through their perspective for the sake of alleviating their suffering. And put another way, and this has been incorporated into the program, basically compassion is empathy plus action. It's maintaining enough distance between you and the other person and what they're feeling that you can actually take action and do something about their state. And fast forward several years, I ended up working at a company here in the Valley, and I was on a team, and the leader of this team was not particularly compassionate towards one of the members of our team. And I, at one point, pulled him aside and said, this needs to change because it's undermining the team. It's demoralizing. We feel badly for our colleague that you're kind of making fun of and joking at his expense because you're so frustrated with him. And I said, he's in that role because of you. You're responsible for him. And if you don't like the job that he's doing, you should do something about it. You should coach him. You should explain how you think it should be done differently. But it's really your responsibility. And if you're frustrated anyone, it should be yourself. And he said, thank you for the advice. I'll think about it. And a few weeks later, he came back and he said, I thought about it. And I think you're right. And I want to thank you. And I'm going to start incorporating that with this individual and everyone on my team. And as he was saying it, I realized I had been making the exact same mistake he was making. I was managing my team, basically seeing the world through my own lens, expecting them to do things the way I wanted them to do them, as opposed to playing to their strengths, putting myself in their shoes, understanding what they wanted to accomplish. And in that moment, I aspired that for as long as I would be in roles where I'd be managing or leading people, I would aspire to manage compassionately. And I say aspire because it's really hard to do, and we'll probably get into that, why it can be so difficult, because we're all human beings and we all see the world through our own lens. And a few years later, just as luck would have it, I was on the road for work, and I was having trouble sleeping, and I was channel surfing when that was still a thing. Netflix wasn't digital yet. And I came across a documentary. It was through a series called PBS Frontline. And this particular episode was called A Class Divided. And up until this point, I increasingly was focused on compassion in my management practice. I didn't know whether or not it could truly be taught. I just decided it was something I wanted to try to do. And this documentary was all about a woman named Jane Elliott, who was a third grade teacher in Iowa, white woman, all white class. And shortly after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, she had decided she had had enough with racism, that she needed to do something about the state of the world. And so she divided her class up in half, light-eyed kids and dark-eyed kids. And on the first day, she told the light-eyed kids that they were superior to the dark-eyed kids. They were smarter, they were better in every way imaginable. And she bestowed all the classroom privileges on the light-eyed kids, and she told the dark-eyed kids they were subordinate. And this was separating kids that had been best friends and always thought of themselves as just kids. And they did an exercise on that first day, a math exercise as a group, and she timed, it was a timed exercise. And the light-eyed kids crushed the dark-eyed kids. Crushed. So the real magic happened the next morning. She told the kids she'd made a horrible mistake, that it was actually the dark-eyed kids that were superior to light-eyed kids. And as you might imagine, the light-eyed kids were completely crestfallen. The dark-eyed kids were somewhat celebratory, although they were a lot nicer than the light-eyed kids had been because they had been in that position the day before. She ran that same math exercise, and the times were reversed, just by virtue of what she told them about themselves. And so what was extraordinary about this documentary was they brought all the kids back together 15 years later, and to a person, they were all members of the civil rights movement, and all of them had stories about how at some point in their lives they had run into bigotry or racism, and they hearkened back to that experience. And they recalled what it was like to be the subjugated class in that class. And they never forgot that. And that's the way they lived their lives, and that's what they taught their kids. And if they ever saw any behavior like that, they would step in to protect the people that were being hurt, simply based on that one exercise that had taken place over roughly 24-hour period. And so having watched that, it occurred to me compassion can be taught. So, you know, through a number of events, maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't, I ended up connecting with a guy who leads an effort called Wisdom 2.0. When I was on stage, Soren Gordhammer's his name, and at the end of that session, we had audience Q&A, and there were a couple thousand people in the audience, and someone said, what do you think the role of compassion in education is? And extemporaneously, I said, I can't imagine anything more important than teaching compassion to our kids. It's more important than math. It's more important than reading. It's more important than writing. It's more important than all of it. It's the foundation upon which everything else should be taught. And the crowd really seemed to like that answer. And about a week or two later, Soren said, that thing you said on stage about education, so we're going to do that. I said, what are you talking about? He said, we're going to make sure every school teaches compassion. You yourself said there's nothing more important, so when are we going to get going with this? And I said, you know, I got a day job, and I'm busy. And he said, we really got to do this. And a couple years later, hooked up with a company called Everfi. Kristen and I had established a really strong working relationship at Oak Knoll on how important it was to teach compassion. She and the rest of the administration and the teachers just have done such an extraordinary job teaching compassion. And from the get-go, we've been working together 6 years. In the earliest time, I said, Kristen, if you can develop a program here that we can make sure would scale across the country, I'll do whatever it takes to help you be successful. And she said, you got it. We may have even shaken hands on it. And so she's helped create this program. You saw the video captured, and we launched it in September. Without spending a single dollar on marketing or distribution, we're already up to about 5,500 schools, 8,800 teachers, and over 100,000 students now have access to this program. And mark my words, every school in this country, every elementary school, will teach compassion before this is done. And every kid will understand the meaning of compassion and be able to practice it.
Great, well, thank you for that. We'll get a little bit more into the Compassion Project. We'll get a little bit more into the specifics of the Compassion Project, but Kristen, I'm interested, you know, you have a parent come in and say to you, I want to teach compassion and so forth. And so I think it begs the question, you know, can compassion be taught, and how does one go about framing such a potentially amorphous idea and making it something that you can both actively teach and then maybe even to some degree measure or have some reflection about progress in compassion and so forth?
Right, so yes, compassion can be taught. I mean, we look at it like when you teach math, right, or you learn to ride your bike, or you're learning how to read. It's the same thing with compassion. The classroom and the school environment couldn't be the more perfect place to learn a skill like compassion. You know, just to back up a little bit, once Jeff, you know, we were, like he said, talking about this, and it had come up through Oak Knoll. I just want to tell the story of how, like, compassion ended up bubbling to the top of everything. We have this great mission, And this kind of goes to how we measure it as
And,
well.
and share your mission. 'Cause I
Yeah,
think
so
it's
our
worth-
mission is every student an exemplary scholar, a valued friend, and a courageous citizen. And we had this extraordinary mission, and it was funny because it was almost like buried. And many schools, all schools have a mission, and they usually are up somewhere, and ours was similar to that. It was, you know, it was in our site plan, and it was a great mission. But we really took it out, and Jeff kind of facilitated this conversation for our team. And we got into, like, what is an exemplary scholar? What is a valued friend? Like, if this is really the recipe, like we believe this is the recipe for student success at our school, we had to dive in and really pick it apart and say, is this the recipe, and what does it mean to be a valued friend? So when we got into exemplary scholar, we had been doing a ton of work for years on making sure our students understood the difference between a fixed and growth mindset. And so when we got to valued friend, we asked the staff, we put it out to the teachers, and we said, what is the most important characteristic that what is the most important characteristic of a valued friend? And without prompting the staff, without talking at all about what that might mean, we actually put it out in a survey, and we had them send us their words back, and compassion was the #1 word out of all the words that, all the different characteristics that were shared. Compassion, 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 compassion for valued friend. And it was incredible. I remember when I was telling Jeff, I was like, oh, you're not going to believe this, the #1 word. And he's like, yeah, right?
Well, you told me,
Yeah.
you told me the stats, and I think over 80% of the teachers who responded included compassion. And I just assumed Kristen had led them there, that it was on a short list and they picked it, and it was an open-ended question. And in that moment, I realized we were seriously onto something.
Right, and for us as a staff, it was clear to me and clear to our school leadership that the teachers valued and believed in teaching compassion, and you could see it in different pockets throughout the school and in different things we were doing. So what happened then was we kind of solidified the recipe, and we started being more strategic and intentional about how we were going to teach these things. If we really feel that exemplary scholars and valued friends and courageous citizens were the recipe for student success, we needed to identify them. We needed to set goals. So each area of our mission has measurable goals that are in our site plan, and we do our own measuring of how we're doing teaching compassion, teaching mindset. These things we reevaluate each year. And we also evaluate, we have more formative assessments. We're always looking at what is bubbling up on our playground. What do the kids need help? What strategy or tool do they need to help them navigate maybe an issue that we're noticing is coming up, or just responding to their needs and as we go, because it's always a work in progress, and it is hard to measure. And I forget the first part of your question, but can it be taught? Yes, it absolutely can be taught. All of our survey data will even show that kids are understanding more about compassion. We'll put scenarios out to them, and we have one question in our survey to our upper grade students. That's a playground situation, and we ask them, how would you respond to this playground situation? And we look at all their responses and see, are they responding with a compassionate solution? And not just, oh, I would tell the student not to do that. We actually look to see if their responses also include how they're helping that student to feel better for saying something to another student. So the situation is more complicated. We started off with a situation that was really simplistic, and now because our students have grown and developed further in this area, we've been able to add more layers and a more complex assessment of these skills. And so yes, it can be taught.
And it sounds like to some degree measured as well.
And so, yeah, absolutely. And I know, Jeff, we've talked about measuring compassion, and there is some work going on in this area.
Yeah, there's a guy named Richie Davidson out of the University of Wisconsin, and he's actually developed a methodology to assess the effectiveness of compassionate education and whether or not kids understand it and can practice and act upon it.
It's great.
And
Go ahead.
well, I was going to say, I know also I would say that just the community has really embraced this. Just even, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, it felt different. Surfacing this as a priority in our school. I felt then like I was having to do more of like, explaining it to the parents why it's important, and we have to continue to do that. But I feel like now at our school, it is very clear we've put a stake in the ground. Social emotional learning, compassion education is just as important as academics, if not more important. It is the foundation, it is the cake, it's not the icing on the cake. And it just feels like we're such great partners now as a community moving forward. And I just find that to be one of the most powerful changes. And I think it's impacting the kids even more. Unfortunately, there's always that pool for us as parents. People don't necessarily always believe that, oh, are you sure all of this social emotional learning is going to really help my kid learn, algebra by 8th grade? And I don't know many college essays that are asking, tell us about a time you were compassionate. But I believe that they should be.
We're going to change that.
Yeah, we are.
By the way, that's not just anecdotal, what Kristen was saying about the way the parents and the community have increasingly embraced these values. So we were just reviewing literally.
Yeah,
We were just
yesterday.
reviewing at Site Council the results of the family surveys through Panorama. And when it came to asking parents what their top priorities were for their kids, it was really interesting to see that while academics on its own as a line item was number one, happiness, SEL, and being well-rounded when combined exceeded academics. And that's not something you would have seen 10,
Right.
20 years ago. That was pretty cool.
So Jeff, you say you have been sort of a student of education and thought about the education world since you were in high school. And obviously you know a bit about the technology world, and I would imagine that there's some comparison in education and technology. In technology, you guys are looking for the viralness or viral ability of something, and in education we're looking at what can we implement that scales, right? And so being somebody who has an appreciation for both education and the challenge that there is to scale something to the degree that you're talking about, which is every elementary school teaching compassion, and thinking about sort of technology's role in making something viral, right? Talk to us a little bit about that partnership that you started with EverFi, which is this company that is sort of sponsoring the work of the Compassion Project to some degree. And what is it about their approach to compassion education that you think is going to increase the scalability of teaching compassion in schools?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So EverFi is an ed tech company, and they actually, over time, have evolved so that their materials can be utilized in primary school, secondary, middle school, high school. So they run the gamut K through 12. They have college education programs and certain kind of curriculum that they bring into colleges. They do compliance training in corporations. And basically, EverFi is focused on developing networks around certain themes or subjects, social emotional learning. They then reach out to companies and organizations that are interested in sponsoring this work, so it's free for schools. Companies can get behind that and associate with it, and the dollars that companies are investing help activate these programs, exactly your point. How do you create the equivalent of virality? How do you ensure that schools are able to access these technologies, these materials, that they can get the best out of them, that they understand how to utilize them? How do you build a distribution mechanism and channel strategy so that you can reach the north of 70,000 primary schools, by way of example, in the United States? And they've just built out this wonderful infrastructure, and beyond that, the people are incredible. It was founded, the CEO, Tom Davidson, is a pretty amazing guy, and he's full of energy and ideas, and it's almost like a double bottom line company in terms of the importance of values and the importance of not just being profitable and creating shareholder value, but the value that can be generated for communities all across the country, and he believes in that so deeply. But the materials that they came up with in terms of the Compassion Project, which started from scratch, just kind of blew me away. The entire approach, from the design elements and the thoughtfulness behind what the characters would look like, the plot lines, the actual curriculum itself, the emphasis not only on written materials, but, and I think Kristen was absolutely critical in this, ensuring that there would be conversations and teachers sitting down with their kids and role playing and talking. And Oak Knoll does this great job of having the kids and teachers get together in a circle each morning and really bringing that kind of approach to it. So EverFi brought a lot of this to the table. And what's interesting is we literally just, it's so funny you just asked this question. So we literally just had a brainstorming session with a guy who's a mentor to me, a guy named Ray Chambers, pretty extraordinary individual. And he brought together a number of luminaries in related fields to talk about what we could do to light this thing up and to create virality, quite literally. And one of the things that I'd like to make sure we pursue is a playbook that was run by the Code.org organization. How many people are familiar with Code.org or have heard of Code.org? For some reason, the right side of the room, left side of the room, not into coding, right side of the room, into software. The Partovi brothers and Hadi in particular is overseeing it day to day, have done this extraordinary job. It's one of the most successful, most effective nonprofit organizations I've seen in the last decade. But just like we want to ensure that compassion is taught in every school, they want to ensure that coding skills are taught in every school in the United States, and they're making it happen. And if you've read any recent results or highlights or success stories about the number of AP students taking software and coding, it's directly related to the success that this organization has started to have in the country. And so they made coding cool. That's where it started. I mean, today everyone recognizes the importance, but when it originally started, people were still like, coding, really? Isn't that for engineers? And it's not for me. So one of the first things they did, they put together a video. And in the video, sure, there were people like Bill Gates who have had extraordinary success coding, but there were also NBA athletes who loved to code, which kids would never would have known, and celebrities who loved to code. And it made coding more accessible, and it made coding something that kids could aspire to. And then they combined that with something called the Hour of Code. And they created essentially a call to action across schools in the country, where for an hour, once a year, everyone would be coding. And they created a contest for schools to submit ideas for how to create excitement around this. And they partnered with an organization called DonorsChoose.org, which I'm on the board of, and that enables teachers to generate funds for projects that they want to invest in that the school budgets can't afford. And all of this came together, and they lit this thing up like a rocket ship. And we're going to take, I was just on the phone this morning with the EverFi folks, we're going to run the same playbook. And rather than call it an hour of code, it'll be an hour of compassion or a day of compassion. We're going to have companies and organizations all across the country get involved and hopefully adopt their school districts, provide funding to ensure activation of their schools, and then create an incentive for teachers to create an act of compassion, because if they do that, we'll create matching funds via Donors Choose for the projects that they're uploading that are oriented towards compassion. So that would be an example. I haven't even had a chance to bring up the speed on all this. It was literally a follow-up discussion we had this morning.
Breaking news, right here.
It is breaking news. And we can see it just clear as day, the path we would need to pursue to just get this thing going. And that's the goal, is to ensure that every school in the country is teaching compassion. And for the next few years, we're going to focus, the program started 2nd through 4th grade, and it'll expand K through 5th. And then once we've got that going, we're going to think about middle school, and then high school, and then we're going to think about universities, vocational training facilities, junior colleges, and then companies. And you know, as Eric said during his intro, I just, in this day and age, with all of this tribalism and all of this antagonism and all of this toxicity and all of this us against them, I just can't think of anything more important right now to bring us together, because God knows we all have some major challenges facing the world. And we're going to need to work together. We're going to need to collaborate to get the best out of ourselves to be able to solve these challenges. And I think compassion is one of the ways we'll do that.
So what I hear you saying is that you want to make compassion cool.
Yes,
It already is.
actually,
All right.
actually, it's, you know, when Kristen says it already is, it is among some people, and it's a movement, and it feels like it's changing. When I first sat on that Wisdom 2.0 stage, in the beginning, Soren and his whole world was oriented towards the expansion of wisdom and compassion, said to me essentially, what's giving you the courage to come on stage and talk about this subject? And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, you're a CEO, and it's not every day you hear CEOs talking about managing compassionately, because in some circles, it's seen as making people vulnerable and weak, and nothing could be further from the truth. The most compassionate people I know, without fail, are the strongest, most self-assured people I've ever met, without fail. And so it was so interesting for him to use that language and ask the question with that kind of energy. And fast forward many years later, and increasingly you see executives all over the country starting to embrace mindfulness and compassion. And it is becoming cool, but that's exactly what we need to do, make it cool.
You know what's interesting about the journey with Everfi, and interesting about the Compassion Project, and I think we definitely pushed Everfi, and the Compassion Project is very different and unique in some ways, because, you know, when I heard about, when Jeff said, oh, we need to bottle what's going on, you know, let's bottle what's going on at Oak Knoll and work with Everfi, and I'm like, ooh, bottle what's going on at Oak Knoll, that's going to be really hard, because we're a pretty unique place. And I'm thinking, like, how is this going to work? Kids are going to learn compassion on the computer? And I'm like, I am not good with that. Like, this needs to be face-to-face. Like, the whole idea is I see you, I understand where you're coming from, and that's how we do it at our school. And so I was trying to get my head around this, and what was just completely awesome was, you know, Jeff kept saying, yeah, well, just do it, you know, whatever she's saying, do it.
Kristen's
like, make it
doing.
happen. And they're kind of like, okay. And, and
This is
so,
my life, by the way, working with Kristen
Just
on a
do what
daily
Kristen's
basis.
doing.
That's right.
Yes.
So, no. So the Oak Knoll staff really helped. They were an integral part of this. And we were able to develop videos, very short videos, because we're very conscious of screen time, and we don't want to overdo the technology piece. And so we created very short videos. Everfi created them, but the scripts our staff had at it. And the idea of the Compassion Project really is unique in that the kids and their teacher watch a quick scenario. All the characters have different personalities and strengths and things they're working on, and it kind of takes you through all the lessons, if you watch them, takes you through the characters' lives together at school, and, you know, after school and things like that. But and so you watch the video, and then you, as the teacher, can engage your class in a discussion, and that's, I think, where the power of this project really is in creating the structure within every classroom across the country to have those discussions, and to build community within the class so that kids feel safe and can share, you know, what they felt a certain character in the video needed and how they relate to that character, and for them to gain perspective of another character. Because I remember our counselor, Nicole Scott, she was going through the scripts, and she said to Everfi, we were having this meeting or conversation, and she said, you have to remember, every kid that is in the video is in the audience. Like, there's every personality, every strength. Some kids, you know, really gravitate to one friend. Other kids are in everyone's business. Other kids, you know, they all have needs, and they all need compassion. It's not just the one you think might need it, it's all of them. And they're all sitting in the classroom watching that video. And so the discussion questions within the program really get the kids thinking and sharing and developing the necessary skills to navigate their own playground and their own world. And that goes, and then it ties into, also, the thing about code.org, which I find fascinating, is not only it became accessible for kids, but it became accessible for teachers.
Yeah.
Because we're not digital natives, right? And teachers now across our school are doing the hour of code. And when they first did it, I remember everyone was like, the hour of code, what are we doing? Like, what is this? But they made it so easy for teachers. And teachers are the most incredible humans on the planet. And they do so much, and they have to teach so much. And they do it, with a smile and always connecting with the kids. And we wanted the Compassion Project to not be something that is just, teachers aren't, interested in because they think, oh, it's one more thing. And so our teachers, some of them that are here tonight, helped us develop these lessons to make sure they're accessible to the teachers as well as the students. And so they're very short lessons, and they end up being like a springboard for conversation, role-playing, and really understanding the meaning of compassion. And so, yeah, it's really exciting work, and I'd say that we're not, at Oak Knoll, and within the district, we're not like heavy program people. We're very much teachers who come to the table with skills, and we see teaching as an art and a science. And so the Compassion Project also is a way for teachers to share. It's really a project. It's not a program, so to speak. It's an initiative. And our hope is also to create a huge community of teachers that are sharing what they do, because that's how all of this was developed, was based on talking to teachers. And what are you doing in your classroom that's working? And what are some of the research-based strategies that help kids learn, like role-playing? I encourage all parents, do role-playing at home with playground situations that come home. Help your child by role-playing and setting them up for success the next day when they go back. And it can be silly and fun, but it really does help. It gives them that practice of that narrative that they're going to go apply the next day with a friend or in a situation. It's very helpful. And so the Compassion Project, includes role-playing and lots of mindfulness, and mindset is in there as well. All the things that we value.
So you bring up a question for me as a parent. So I have 3 children, 2 of whom are young. And I would say that, and this, I think, this question is appropriate for you too, as you think about like that compassion can be something that can be taught, is that, just like you were saying, Nicole Scott had these kids in the video and was trying to share with Everify that every single one of those kids is represented in the classroom. And I think about my own children, and I love them, and they're dear, and of course I think they're the smartest, most greatest people in the world. That's actually not true, I don't. But one of them is not inclined to empathy. Compassion isn't his first go-to. And I know as a parent of 3 children, and my other 2 are like exceedingly emotive and empathetic without me having to say a word, right? And I wonder, if I could project my own experience to what some other parents might be in here is, are there kids who just can't learn compassion? How should we as adults see these kids in these situations where they're making mistakes and maybe not responding in the way that we would want them to?
Well, I believe all kids can learn, and so are certain things harder for all of us to learn than other things? Yes, right? Some kids might need to work extra hard on learning, their math skills, while other kids it might come easy for them to get in someone else's shoes. I mean, we all have strengths and we all have things we're working on. And, I think a strategy to develop empathy, which is something that I think is a great thing for all of us as parents to do now and continue to do, is, and we do in our classrooms and is part of also the project, is use literature. There are so many great children's books. I mean, almost every children's book is an example of a problem, someone who needs compassion, and you can really build empathy through learning about different situations, different cultures, different ways of living. There are so many stories out there that can help build your child's empathy bank, and that's how we see it at Oak Knoll. We work on making sure we're sharing a diverse amount and a diverse, collection of literature, so that students also, they see themselves within the book. That's really important, and that they see friends, and it helps if you're guiding the discussion. So to build empathy, yes, it might take more practice for some kids than others, right? And just like anything else, they need time to practice. I think sometimes we think, oh, these incidences happen at school, and as parents, I would say, this doesn't happen for me as a parent because I'm a principal of a school, so I'm well aware of what happens at a school that's normal. But what I would say is I could see how parents who don't work in a school could react to a situation that happens at school like, oh, what is going on? Why did this happen? And our answer is often like, we are glad it happened because we're in an elementary school. We want the kids to make mistakes here.
Did you hear that, parents?
We want them to. I actually, when kids get sent to the office, how we handle that is always a very similar way. The first thing we say is, the most important thing is honesty. So we always value honesty first. Honesty is most important. And we just say it's okay if you made a mistake. We just want, it's important for them to say they have made a mistake and to tell us what has happened. And so once we get that out of the way, we say, I am so glad you made this mistake because now you can learn something that actually can help you for the rest of your life. And making it in an elementary school couldn't be there's no better place to make mistakes, especially with social emotional learning and not being compassionate, than in an elementary school. It is set up for kids to make mistakes. And we develop a climate. I think positive school climate and compassion education go hand in hand. It's sort of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. I look at it like that because, if you're embedding compassion education, you're being strategic and intentional, that will develop a positive school climate where kids can thrive. Or if you're developing a school climate where kids can thrive, chances are the way to do that is to be compassionate and to be a compassionate leader and model compassion. So they go hand in hand. And I can tell you, the kids, they need to have unstructured playtime. They need to have a recess that is unstructured so they can go out there and figure it out. And that is the best place for them to learn compassion, is on an unstructured playground.
So my kid's going to be okay?
Yeah,
okay.
He'll be okay.
Okay.
But unstructured playtime, read the books.
Got it.
Lots of talking.
Jeff, before we turn it over to the audience, I'm curious, how does this passion for compassion influence your work as a CEO of a large company? And how do you see these ideas that we're talking about play out in the world of adults, which I would imagine also struggle at times with being compassionate?
When you say also struggle, I think they struggle far more. Yeah. And you were asking earlier, can it be taught? I believe it can be. Kristen, was saying the same. And what's so, I think, compelling about teaching compassion in elementary school is you still have an opportunity to get into kids' approach to one another when they're still forming and developing the way in which they see the world and the way in which they connect with others. By the time they've graduated school and they've had a couple of jobs under their belt and they're working at your company, most people have a pretty clear view of the world and have developed practices and habits. So it becomes much harder later in life, but still very doable. You know, for us at LinkedIn, it's become one of our first principles in terms of how we manage. Every employee of the company, we've got, you know, north of 14,000 folks, and to a one, pretty much they'll understand and be able to explain to you the difference between empathy and compassion, and the fact that when you're in a meeting or having an interaction with a colleague, if there's friction or tension, that if that person gets angry and you get angry, that's an empathetic response. And what's important in those moments is to become a spectator of your own thoughts, especially when becoming emotional, and ask yourself, what's going on? Why are you getting angry? And then once you have the opportunity to kind of reset yourself, you can then put yourself in the other person's shoes and start asking the question implicitly or hopefully explicitly, why are they angry? And what's happening such that this friction is taking place? And most of us, by virtue of being so egocentric, which shouldn't be confused with egomaniacal, egocentric is seeing the world through your own lens. Egomaniacal is the fact that the world revolves around you. And you know, this egocentrism, typically when we experience conflict, and all of us experience conflict, no matter what organization we're in and no matter who we're working with, the knee-jerk response is to assume the other person has nefarious intention. It's never your fault when there's tension or a conflict. It's always the other person. What's wrong with them that they don't agree with me? What are they trying to pull here? You know, what kind of politics is taking place? Are they trying to get one over on me? How could they be so ignorant? And far more often than not, it has nothing to do with those assumptions. You may have said something that reminded them of a situation they were once in that hurt them and made them feel vulnerable. You may be so expert on a subject that it's making them insecure. They may have woken up that day and they're just having a bad day. It's got nothing to do with you. There's a long litany of reasons that person may be responding the way that they are. And if you can take the time to understand where they're coming from, what they're trying to solve for, and help them to achieve that objective, that is going to forge a much stronger connection. One of two things happens when you're in an organization and you're having a meeting where there's that kind of tension. The tension goes unresolved, which is typically what happens in most organizations, and then those two people or a group of people leave that meeting, and what do you think they do? They go off and they vent to their colleagues. I can't believe the meeting I just had. I can't believe that other person, how dare them talk to me like that and have this opinion. And you're taking that negative energy, you're spreading it to your team. The other person's doing the same. And this is happening every day across countless meetings. That's being compounded across thousands of people within your organization. And over time, that becomes embedded as part of the culture of the organization, even though no one's aspiring to behave like that. And it sows mistrust and conflict. And now let's take the flip side. You're in that meeting, you get angry, I start to get angry, I catch myself, I say, I'm sorry if I said something to anger you, why are you getting angry? I start to dig in, we come back to what it is that we were trying to solve for to begin with. You feel like I'm looking out for you, we solve a problem, we leave the room, and we share the story about how we were able to resolve a conflict. And the next time we have a meeting like that, there's going to be more trust. And the next time we have a meeting like that, that's going to start to manifest itself in terms of shorthand. Not only are we not creating tension and conflict, we understand one another better, which means we can make better decisions faster. And that's how you create value within an organization. So that's one of the reasons it's so important to practice compassion, and it's one of the reasons it's become a first principle for us.
Wonderful. Awesome.
You know, it's so interesting when you said, you know, that person could have had a bad sleep, or, you know, something I've seen in a classroom that I think is super effective, and we should start doing it at our meetings. Now, the teacher, they start the day in their circle, and the teacher goes around and asks the class, 1 to 5, how'd you sleep? This is the first thing they do. And the kids show, 1 being, I had a horrible sleep, or 5, I had a great sleep. And they whip around with they just put up their number and they go around. And she does that because she tells the kids, you know so much already about how that person might be today by knowing how they slept. So if a kid shares, I had a horrible sleep, I was up, my baby brother was up, whatever, then we can be more empathetic that day and know, like, oh, you might need extra time, or you might need something. And I just think that's such a simple strategy, but what does it do? It, one, gives the teacher some information. It, two, builds the classroom community, and the kids in themselves see it as, yeah, I am an individual, I have needs, and my community is going to support me through this. And again, it's just a little thing that a teacher does every morning that I see as extremely effective and compassionate in even just the act of asking, how did you sleep? And it's accessible to everybody, right? We've all had times, I mean, everyone sleeps at night or has a bad sleep or a good sleep. It's just an easy way to start the day. And I was thinking, gosh, can you imagine if our meetings all started like that? How'd you sleep? Oh, okay, we'll be extra, we'll be careful, sensitive
There's
to you.
countless, like literally countless examples like this. And hopefully this project can start to take and create best demonstrated practices for how we enable people to walk a mile in the other person's shoes. So Kristen was explaining to me, it may have been the beginning of the school year last year, about how some of the kids are being bused into Oak Knoll. And unbeknownst to me, that can take an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Do you guys know that? There's kids being bussed in, and they have to cover several miles. It ain't 60 miles. But because of the number of stops and because of the
And the
infrastructure,
And Menlo Park traffic.
process, traffic, because of all of this, it can take an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Can you imagine coming to Oak Knoll every morning and taking an hour to an hour and 15 minutes and how that would affect you? Speaking of sleep, you're getting that much less sleep. God knows the kind of stress you're going through and the mood that you're in when you set foot in the school. So take a kid who lives 2 blocks away, that's walking there every morning with their mom or their dad, and that energy and feeling so good and everything being so familiar, and then have that kid spend an hour and 15 minutes on a bus ride, a bunch of people you don't know, going all over the place, and finally ending up at school. That's how you help kids to understand where the other person's coming from. And it changes everything. It's funny, Kristen mentioned the importance of literature. You inadvertently mentioned a word that's the title of a book that became a movie that does this as well as any I've seen, which is wonder. You said, I wonder. I thought you were going there. But wonder is the story of a kid who had been disfigured and the people in his life. And normally in a book like this, or a movie like this, it would focus on the kid and the way the kid sees the world. But this author did something very different, and each chapter was dedicated to a different character. And it's like Akira Kurosawa and Rashomon, and that we all see the world through our own lens. And so each of these chapters told the story through a different character. And all the people you would have assumed were fine, the pretty, most popular girl, for example, the stuff she was going through you never could have imagined if you just saw the world through the lens of the protagonist. And it was so interesting. I had never heard you tell the story about the brainstorming and the importance of, Nicole, was it, that told everyone that you need to see the world through other people. We hadn't shared notes on this, but I had the exact same input to the team. The original animation was all centered around a number of kids, an athlete, the popular one, the smart one, and then the kid that looked like they were a little bit awkward. And it focused on that kid. And that's the way it would traditionally work. And this is how aligned we are and how similar our ethos is, and the school, not just the two of us. But I said, no, you can't do it that way. They said, what do you mean? And I said, that kid that you're assuming is the popular one, you know what they're going through? Or the athlete? Or the smart one? The pressure that they're under, maybe, by their parents, pushing them constantly, and the anxiety that they feel. And you could do it for every single kid in every one of these animations, and the same happens every day in every classroom. So the ability to just understand that, to recognize, whether it's asking how much sleep you got, whether it's putting the kid on a bus for a change, whether it's buttoning your shirt with the opposite hand.
Yeah, we did that.
Any of you tried to do that? To teach a kid what it's like to be a person with disabilities? These are the tools that we can utilize to help people understand the value of seeing the world through another person's perspective.
Wonderful. Well, they were worried that they wouldn't have much to say in this beginning and were cautioning me, we better get to the audience questions really fast. And so obviously they have a lot to say, but we have some volunteers that would love to hand you a mic and allow you the opportunity to ask some questions to our guests.
Thanks for the chat. Jeff, you mentioned earlier, and I think you started going down that path of the difference between empathy and compassion, but I think you talked about empathy, and if you could clarify, that would be great.
Sure.
Thanks.
So I still, to this day, I didn't mention it, but if you were to look on my nightstand, I still have the book there, The Art of Happiness. And it's, I guess, 19 years it's been there. And I only read it cover to cover that one time, but it reminds me immediately of some of the most valuable things I learned as soon as I see it. And that was probably the most valuable lesson I learned. And the way the Dalai Lama really illustrates the difference between empathy and compassion is this way. He says, if you were walking along a mountainous trail and you were to come along a path and there was someone there and there was a boulder on their chest and they were suffocating as a result, the empathetic response, feeling what that person feels, you too would be suffering and you wouldn't be able to help them. And that's empathy, is feeling what they're feeling. Compassion, potentially drawing upon empathy, as Kristen was describing earlier, having experienced something like that at some point in your life, you recognize that person's suffocating. You recognize the suffering that they're experiencing. And in that moment, you say, I'm going to do everything within my power to alleviate that suffering. I'm going to remove the boulder from their chest. That's the difference between empathy and compassion. Compassion's empathy plus action. And all too often, you see it, and you see some pretty powerful and influential luminaries. I see it all the time. They talk about empathy and aspiring to empathy. But empathy is a means to an end. And there are unintended consequences of just practicing empathy. It's a very important building block in terms of practicing compassion effectively, but it's not the end game.
Thank you for your question. Another question? One over here.
Hi, thank you. Ooh, this was loud. Thank you so much for explaining the difference between compassion and empathy and just in general for the program that you're having at the schools. I think it's crucial that we teach our children about compassion at a really young age. The question I have is, how do you navigate compassion in the world of social media and video games where that face-to-face interaction is lost and your elementary school kids are now teenagers and they're losing that ability to make those differences?
Great question. Kristen, you want to start with that?
Sure. So I would say that the goal is that the students will apply the same skills when they're online, right? Currently in our district, we really capitalize on what Common Sense Media has done, and they provide a lot of digital citizenship lessons, which again, our teachers have engaged the students in, and I think they're phenomenal. But it ends up being essentially the same skills, right? It's more difficult because the kids now don't see the response. So when I hurt you, I see your face telling me I've hurt you. And when I'm online and I'm texting, I was gonna go like this, but that's not really what the kids are doing. Show my age. No, so when I'm online, I don't get to see that response. And so it then becomes emotionless, right? Like there's not a lot of emotion there to signal to me that, oh, I've hurt you. And it makes it a lot easier, right? And so again, it's the conversations, it's the scenarios, talking to your kids, saying before you give them the world in their hands and hand them a phone, it is really important to remember that you are handing them the world. And it's starting when they're very young and talking about these things, right? Like what would you do if you were on a group text and you see somebody is writing to the group and saying something that's very hurtful? What are you gonna do? You didn't write it, it's not to you, but how will you be compassionate in that moment that's so hard? And I think it really comes back to continually talking to your kids about these things and having those conversations, and it's so they have a plan, right? They have a tool on their belt. So when that surfaces, they have the tool and they can apply it. It's the same with, in high school. There's even more, right? I mean, the world opens up. And so, I will tell you, I by no means am feeling like I'm at the top of being a compassionate parent, okay? There's no expert here around that. And I would also say that compassion, like the work we do on growth mindset, growth and fixed mindsets, we have them both, right? We learn about the difference, and we can put on the growth mindset and have the language and get really comfortable taking that approach, that having a growth mindset. Same with compassion. I see it as, everybody's going to make mistakes. I mean, sometimes you're going to be like, oh, that wasn't very compassionate of me that I just said that or did that. Again, it's providing the kids, building that lens. So they have that lens. They can, like you said, they can, see their own, how they're behaving. I forget how you phrased it. It was like they can see their own thoughts, or
be a spectator to your own thoughts.
Be a spectator to your own thoughts. That's really developing that lens. And it goes for social media. It goes for underage drinking. It goes, thinking about consent. I mean, all of these topics fall under this umbrella. And I believe the strategy is start young, have open dialogue with your kids, and approach it in a way that they know, we're all going to make mistakes, but honesty, right? Most important, and let's keep talking. Let's keep talking. Let's have those, go through the scenarios, and also work together as parents. We're a community. And so I believe together, the more together we are on these things, the better off all of our kids will be.
I think there's two things that come to mind immediately. The first is more evolutionary and societal, and I'm optimistic over time we'll get it right, but it's going to be rocky for the foreseeable future, because human beings evolved over tens of thousands of years, and we're social animals. And the way in which we communicate with one another is very much based on our ability to see one another, body language, inflection, all kinds of subtextual communication that is completely lost when you're behind a screen. It's just non-existent. So thankfully we're very adaptive, and I think over time we're going to figure it out. We're in a period right now where the technology and our form of communication has evolved much faster than we have. So what can we do about that? There's at least two things that come to mind. The first is recognizing that there's a person on the other side. And I think you see people commenting all the time and going at one another in ways they never would if they were there in person, ever. And so just constantly reminding, if you're talking about your kids and you feel like they're expressing themselves or communicating or sharing something or commenting on something that they wouldn't do if the other person was there with them, just reminding them of that, I think can make a big difference. We were talking about role-playing earlier, but pretend you're the person on the other end and ask your kid to say to you in person what they're writing, and watch how they struggle, because they'd never do that. They're too decent. So that's one. The second is there's a very vicious cycle that takes place with a lot of the social media in terms of another human need, which is to be heard and validated by others. And so what happens is most of us, if not all of us, at one point or another will share something, comment on something, like something, and we will measure ourselves by the response that it generates. The number of clicks, the number of likes, the number of comments, and we just constantly go back to check, how are we doing? And there's a feedback loop that gets generated, because the stuff that is most provocative, the stuff that is most emotional, that's the stuff that generates the greatest response. So there's an incentive to say harsher and harsher things and to be more out there. And I think it's really important that we remind our children that is not an ideal source of self-esteem. To measure ourselves by the way we treat other people to measure ourselves by the way in which we are providing services to our community, the way we practice compassion, love, kindness, generosity, loyalty, dedication. Those increasingly should be the source of our self-esteem, not the number of likes we generate.
I want to thank you, both of you, for that. I think those super wise words, and I'm going to step out of my role of facilitator for a moment and talk a little bit too specifically about social media and our responsibility, opportunity as parents. And as you were asking your question, the thing that that really was most prescient in my mind was the idea that darkness cannot survive the light. And that so much of a child's world on social media, and I specifically am using the word child, on social media is as dark as it is because it's hidden. And when we can create, if we are to allow our children at whatever, and this talk isn't about when to allow social media or anything like that, nor are we experts or anything like that, but if our children are to be on social media, the most important piece of advice that I can share with parents is don't let them be on it alone. And what I mean by that is not that you're constantly looking over their shoulder or that, if one kid posts one thing terrible and you don't like it, that you take it away or anything like that, but that they are not navigating this world alone without you, because when what they experience and what they see on social media, which regardless of whether you are allowing it or not, they are impacted by it, they see it, they're influenced by it. If they have to navigate that alone because you're unwilling to acknowledge that it's impacting their life, whether they're on it or not, whether they tell you they're on it or not, or whether you allow them to be on it or not, it's so important to recognize that it is such a reality in the lives of our kids starting at 5th grade and up, that if they are to navigate that alone, it is going to be very difficult for you to bring light into that darkness, whatever that darkness is about how we treat people or what others are saying or what have you. And they're going to be inundated by all of these messages and visuals and mindsets and whatever, and they're going to want to make sense of it. And I try to encourage parents not to get so overwhelmed by how different it is than the way we grew up or how offensive it might be, and actually just embrace that it is a reality of the world of kids today, and that we don't want our own rejection of what we see to stop us from being available for our kids to navigate it and figure out how to do this. And I think maybe what we should see is social media as an opportunity to create teachable moments rather than it is as an opportunity for us to create punishment or boundaries that at the end of the day are really difficult for most kids to operate within, because even if they're not on social media, so much of their influence within their peers is impacted by the social media that's happening with or without them.
Right. Just as you were talking, it made me think how I was saying earlier about the elementary school environment being a place where kids can practice and try these things on because it's this safe environment where we want them to do that. See your home, and when they're starting to use social media as that same place, if they're trying it on, they're trying out, you're there, you're creating the safe environment so that, when these things come up, you can, take it as a formative assessment for yourself and inform their needs and react and help them navigate that world, just as the school, when you're thinking about compassion on the playground and the kids interacting and having their roller coaster ride, which they will, we're there to support them just as we are as parents at home.
Just building on that last thought too, taking advantage of the fact that this is a community and we do have physical proximity to one another. At this early age, borrowing from Eric's point about shining a light on it and hopefully being able to participate, or having your kids come to you and say, look at this response to something I did. it hurt my feelings. And in that moment, you can say, rather than potentially misinterpret what that other person was saying, when you're at school the next day, why don't you ask them what they had in mind? And so it kind of combines both points that you were just raising. If that interaction is happening in the darkness that Eric was talking about, without your knowledge, there's a very high likelihood that it's going to come back to that interaction I was describing in the office, where people just assume nefarious intent. And so a kid says something because they're trying to show off and get more clicks or likes. Your kid is hurt by it. The other kid may not have really meant to hurt your kid. And in the darkness, your kid's going to respond with anger, and it's going to escalate. And who knows, someone may say something that gets out of control and really does lasting damage. But if you can get involved earlier on and say, whoa, whoa, rather than assume that, why don't you ask them what they meant or why they did that? And I think far more often than not, it's going to be a better explanation than your child may have originally interpreted.
We probably have time for about one more question. You have one over here? 2 mics, all right. We'll take those 2 last questions, so go ahead.
So I'll try and make this as brief as possible. So I had a big aha when Jeff was first talking, and I was trying to think of what was going on, because I could feel emotion bubbling up in me. And when I was 12, in middle school, I was in the change room at gym, and there was a girl she was Native American. She'd been adopted into a really difficult family, and she made fun of one of the girls in the change room. And she was speaking to me. She said, "Hey, do you like Natasha's pants?" And I said, I don't think that's very nice. And I was trying to stick up for her. And all of a sudden, this girl jumped up on the bench and starts threatening me. And nobody went and got the gym teacher, and she was threatening to beat me up. And what I realized is that I have had this thing about being compassionate, like not realizing that I thought it was dangerous.
It's a trigger for you.
And so what it made me think when you're talking about teaching people about compassion is that it may be difficult. I think in some ways people unlearn compassion because it becomes not safe. And so I was just even thinking, when you say your kids, 2 of them are really compassionate, the other one, who knows, maybe something happened where he thought, not cool, that's not an okay thing to do. I'm going to get in trouble, or I'm going to get made fun of. And so I just wonder if in teaching compassion, you can also kind of try and uncover some of the reasons why people may not be compassionate in the first place.
Great point.
So thank you for sharing that. I can still hear the emotion. It's amazing, right? You were 12 years old.
Totally.
It's so many years later, right?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah. So one of the most frequently asked questions I get on the subject of managing compassionately and treating other people with compassion, people will say, "I heard you talk about compassion, and I find that it's really easy with the people I love and care about, but the people I don't like, I find it really difficult." And my response is, that's the whole point, that compassion is not conditional, that compassion matters the most when you have the weakest connection. That's when you are most inclined to start making assumptions. And it's in those moments where we really need to be, as we've been describing, a spectator to your own thoughts. Now, if you're in harm's way, if someone is physically threatening you, there was actually a restraining order that ended up getting the girl. So, there's a time and a place for everything that we're describing. And someone about to do physical harm to you is not the time or the place to try to understand what they've been going through and whether or not they're having a bad day, and in all seriousness.
Yeah, it is.
So we all have to use judgment. When's the right time? And the right time in the situation you were describing may not have been when that girl jumped up and started to physically threaten you. But registering then, I wonder what in the world has happened to her that she got so triggered. What's going on there? And maybe talking to a teacher or a counselor and saying, I think there's something wrong. And hopefully enabling that young lady to get the help she needs. for someone to be able to ask her in a quiet moment where she's not as agitated, better understand where she's been and what she's been going through. But you do have to be careful. I think it's so important, the point that you raised, especially in this day and age, right? There's a time and a place for this stuff, and you have to be very conscious of who you're dealing with and in what environment that interaction's taking place.
All right. We have time for one more question.
Okay, this has been great, and now I feel a lot of pressure having the last question. This actually comes from my 16-year-old who is a graduate of Oak Knoll, and she's brought up quite a bit, and living in Silicon Valley, the emphasis on STEM, and that many of the solutions for our world probably more come from, she hasn't used the word compassion, but the study of humanities and walking in someone else's shoes and understanding someone else. And there has been such an emphasis on STEM nationally, internationally, as well as in our own community of Silicon Valley. So how do you see compassion here in Silicon Valley and that emphasis on STEM versus the humanities, and how can we find that balance?
Great.
In
final question.
a really quick ending.
Thank you.
Eric, that's a good one for you. In all seriousness, as a superintendent,
Yes.
I would love to hear how you would approach
Go ahead,
that.
Eric.
Wait a second, is this in the rules? I think you bring up a good point, and I think with much in education, everything is cyclical. And I fully expect that we will find a time when we realize, like, I'll give an example that we're living in right now, right? So when I was going through school, I'm not near retirement, but I'm also not a spring chicken. And when I was going through school, technical education was all the rage, right? It was all about, hey, you know, we are going to educate kids for the future that is most likely to be successful for them, that they feel is most important, and the trades are really, really important, right? And then a few years after I got out of school, you saw this dramatic switch, right? And it was college for all. It was everybody needs to be prepared for college, even if they don't choose it, and technical schools were really just ways of further creating inequities among communities and so forth, and that the kids who were being directed towards the trades were certain types of kids, and so on and so forth. And so you saw literally, like, there are, I could probably count the number of high schools on one hand that I know of in the Silicon Valley that still have a wood shop, right? And now all you see is this huge pendulum swing back to career technical education, and they talk about it as though it's like this new idea, right? And that is unfortunately the reality of education, is it has pendulum swings. And I think the same is true, not that we will ever not need STEM, and not that we will not ever need people to be good people and have compassion. It's just, you know, where is the economic interest? Where is the political interest? Where is the viral topics of the day that sort of, you know, come to the forefront? And my encouragement to you is that because there's been a big focus on STEM does not mean there hasn't been a big focus on these other things. It simply means that the pendulum reminds us that really everything is important, that we're not just building automatons to do one thing well, we're building people, right? And, you know, one of the things that I think should be totally encouraging to all of you, assuming all of you are in our district, but I'm sure some of you aren't and were drawn by our amazing luminaries here, Kristen chief among them, is that you have access to a K-8, now pre-K-8 school district that is focusing on the whole learner, right? And yes, we have coding classes, yes, we have maker spaces, but we also have world language for kids starting in preschool. Every child in our district has access to world language. We have social emotional learning for every child. So those circles that Jeff and Kristen mentioned about that happen at Oak Knoll, those happen across our district. Every single teacher in our school district is trained on restorative practices, and one strategy is the restorative circle. And they do them at least once a week in their classrooms, some of them every day, to really address the needs of that whole child, right? We hope try to build kids' writing skills as much as we try to build their deductive reasoning skills or their numeracy skills or their problem-solving skills or whatever it is. And I think that while you see a lot of these things happen on sort of the larger political sphere, I think a lot of that is more economic and more political than it is what's really happening at the day-to-day operation of a school system. And schools would be silly not to follow those pendulums, because particularly for low-income districts, when you follow those pendulums, it oftentimes comes with additional resources and finances and so forth. You don't see that as much in districts like ours because we don't have to follow those money trails, but there's a lot of people of power and influence that when they get excited about something, they want to put a lot of money towards it, and a school would be silly not to go follow that. But I have yet to see a school district that loses all of the things that are really important for whatever is the flavor of the moment, right? I would say where STEM is most important is in a couple areas. First of all, we would hope that all fields have access and opportunity for people from all different walks of life, which includes gender. And I think the thing that's most important for folks to understand about STEM is that it isn't that that STEM is better than anything else. It's that, first of all, our country is not doing a good job of preparing our citizens for the jobs that are going to be available to them over the course of the next 60 years. But also that field is not representative of the larger community. And what we know about STEM careers is they are, on the whole, much more high paying and give much more access to upward mobility than a lot of careers do. And if we don't provide access for women, for people of color, for first-generation college-bound students in those areas, then we're doing something wrong, right? And I also think that maybe it's STEM right now, and then some people call it STEAM because it's like science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and I'm sure somebody's going to put a silent E on the end because we need to do it with like English too, and then at some point it's just going to be what we've always done, which is focus on the whole child and making sure that opportunities are available to everyone regardless of their background. And that includes career technical education, it includes STEM fields, it includes higher learning, it includes multilingualism, it includes being able to interact in a global economy, and it includes compassion, right? About building good people, because if our current politics tell us anything, it's that I likened our current political situation to a car accident. That we know we shouldn't look, we know we shouldn't slow down, but we just can't take our eyes off of it. And it's because inside all of us are those basal negativities, those basal lack of compassion, lack of understanding, lack of empathy, wanting to or fear, the tribalism like you talked about, and we fall into it because it's like a freak show. It's the same reason why reality TV is so popular, is because we know it's ridiculous and we can't look away, and it speaks to our own insecurities in ways that are super powerful. And I think that this time in our society is yearning for the kind of work that Kristen and Jeff are passionate about and advocating for. And I commend them, and I think you all probably join me in commending them for their leadership, their vision, and their ability to put their time, energy, and resources towards seeing that every elementary school student can have access to compassion education. So let's give them a big round of applause.
Eric, really quick, I just want to say, none of this, of anything that happens in school, couldn't happen without our teachers. And I think we should give them a round of applause because all of the stuff they do.
And April 10th at 6:30 p.m., everything you wanted to know about sex and puberty, but were afraid to ask. We'll see you then. Thank you so much.
That's right.
Don't forget your kids if you brought them.